Okay, good afternoon. My name is Elena Pourmal, and I am working I'm holding this session for Gerd, who is on vacation for this and next week. And the first thing I would like to address, one of the questions that was in, I believe it was submitted to us a few weeks ago about the global log that we have, some fixes for file logging that we had in 1.12.1, and if they're propagated to other releases. And the answer is no. That fix, and I'm showing it on my screen right now, you can see, we added an option to make the global thread safe log a recursive read-write log. This change was only applied to 1.12 series of the releases, and that will stay there. Usually, according to our development process, we first put the change into develop, and it was true at the time when it was done before, I believe we were really thinking about 1.13 release that will be coming soon. But the point is, it exists only in 1.12 branch. We couldn't bring it back to develop branch because due to vol interfaces and some changes that were done to support some multi-threading in vol connectors, that change cannot be easily propagated to develop. And as you see from the note in release notes, it is really available only for Linux with pthreads. And it's not a default version at all. You have to use special configure flag, enable recursive read-write logs to enable it. Otherwise, the code is exactly the same as we had it since 1.4 release, I believe. And the reason is that the solution we put in 1.12 is not quite portable on Windows. Once again, we need to do a lot of work. So you may ask why we even put this, why we bother. Some of you may remember that there was a lot of discussion that on hold now, but I hope we'll renew it pretty soon, about how we can make HDF library multi-threaded. And the idea was to have a log that can be pushed down into different levels of the library and allowing multiple threads to come in and at least be concurrent in some places of the library that can made a thread safe. So first of all, that work never happened. And after really considering how difficult it will be and how maintainable it will be, there are a lot of doubt that this is the right approach. And we are coming with different approach that may be more useful. So while this read-write log doesn't hurt anything, it works exactly like previous log was, but that work is not going to any other releases because we don't think that it is really useful. Maybe someone will prove us wrong, we'll see, but to summarize, that change is not going anywhere. So please let me know in questions, emails, if I answered your question, and if maybe I addressed the wrong question. So please let me know. So I will stop sharing that window, and I will go now to, first of all, any questions? Do you have any questions? If not, I want to talk today about moving to different releases in HDF5. And I have a small presentation, let me put here. Maybe you saw that presentation. I recorded it a few years ago when we just working on 1.12 release, but I think it's still relevant because we have a lot of customers that are still on 1.8 and 1.10 releases, while our latest release is 1.12.1, and we will be coming pretty soon by the end of the year with so-called unstable releases, which will be released from develop branch, and I will address what does it mean. But our current maintenance releases are 1.12.1, 1.10.7, and 1.8.22. And we still support 3 different branches, 3 different lines of releases, and we really want to drop 1.8 and 1.10. The only reason we still didn't drop those 1.8 and 1.10 releases is because by introducing a lot of new features in 1.10 and 1.12, we managed to, for some use cases, affect performance of applications. And I will talk a little bit about it. But since then, when we first discovered it, we did a lot of work in develop branch, and then with 1.12. As I said, it was very specific cases, not affecting everyone. So we encourage people to move to 1.12 if possible. In this presentation, kind of hint you what you can encounter and what you shouldn't be doing when you're moving to the new releases. So I will be talking about compatibility issues when you move to every major release. And by major release, we call different major releases when we change the second number in our release version. So why we have 3 numbers? It really was a convention, I believe, 25 years ago, and we followed new convention for major, minor, and release numbers. So those are called. And major number was reserved for dramatic changes in HDF5. So it's, when you think about dramatic changes, you can think like, oh, it's probably HDF6. It meaning file format is different, everything is different. Release number, which is that major, we call those maintenance releases. And what happens, we issue major maintenance release when we do changes or extensions into HDF file format. And this is when we change this number. And when we do minor releases, maintenance releases, when we change in the third number, it usually has those releases, they have only bug fixes and maybe new APIs, but no file format changes. So what I would like to do or to talk today is how you move from one maintenance release, major maintenance release, to another maintenance release, what kind of issues you can encounter. And I would really encourage everyone to start moving to 1.12 series and the latest in 1.12 series, because many performance issues were addressed, and maybe your application will not be affected, but you will have all advantages of bug fixes, vulnerability fixes, and so on. If you have any questions, you always can send to help at hdfgroup.org. And let me now go to those release issues, those points. The first major release of 1.12 was in more than a year and a half ago, and we had 1.12.1, I believe, last July. So major releases, as I said, this release contained file format extensions and very important architectural change that allows us to introduce new virtual object layer. There will be special webinar on it, so stay tuned. But the point is, architecture was changed, new APIs were added, and there were some changes to the file format because we added new features called external references and selection encoding. As you know, we have reference objects to reference to object and reference to selections data types, and they were in the same files. You could reference things in the same file. That feature was extended, and we can reference to the objects and selections in the data sets in other HDF5 files, and we needed file format change. And there was some performance enhancements. For example, library was reworked for hyperslab selections. New drivers were added, read-only S3 driver to access HDF5 on Amazon and on Hadoop file system. And you can see all these changes. Let me quickly stop sharing here and exit. Maybe I will go, first I will show this slide. If you're not aware, if you go to our portal, I will encourage everyone to go under HDF5 application developers guide and look at release specific information. You will find things, what happened between releases, major releases. You will find what our compatibility issues are. You will find descriptions to the new features and appropriate documents. So let me go back to file format compatibility and what HDF TG promises when we work on new releases of HDF5. First of all, application built with the latest HDF5, which is now 1.12 releases, can always access files created by the previous version of the library. You do not need to worry about can you access data created before. You always, if you cannot, please let us know immediately. This is wrong and this has to be fixed. We also promise forward compatibility. For example, if you take the latest release, which has, for example, Swimmer, it has virtual data sets, you have new references, and you use this release, but your application never uses these features, then the file created by application that is still linked with, say, HDF5 1.8, you should be able to, those files should be able to be read first with 1.12, but files, if you use HDF5 1.12 to create files without using new features, all old applications should be able to read those files. So once again, any new features, if you are not enabling them, or if you are not using H5P setlib bounds function that tells to use specific file format, shouldn't affect your forward compatibility. Any questions about it? I was not explaining it quite correctly, but I think I hoped I managed it. Any questions? Okay, so this, I want to share with you some graphs about setlib bounds. So what we discovered, let me share new graph. What we discovered that some of our users think that setting new file format for HDF5 is always better, and this is not the case. Just let me stop a little bit on what does it mean newest file format. In HDF5, there is no specific version of the file format. What is happening that sometimes when we add new features, we add extensions to file format, and we, for example, find a bug and we need to fix some particular pieces, say, of data set that is represented by object message in file format. That object message thing that is encoded in HDF5 file will be versioned. And when we say use the latest file format with h5lib bounds function, it says to the library, if you take on any message that you operate with to encode data in HDF5 file, use the latest version of this message. And that's how you may create backward forward incompatibility, because even you use data set and you use chunk data set, when you're told use the latest version, it will mean that a library will use, for example, different indexing schema that was not available in 1.8 or 1.6 versions, and you will get incompatibility. But more than that, sometimes people use that new libver latest to use new feature that may be required or maybe not required, because library, for example, for VDS, you do not need to set up and call this function. You will have overhead for regular use case, and this graph represent. So we have an application that creates a lot of data sets, almost 1 million data sets under the root group. And you can see the dark columns, and you can see the versions of the library on the bottom. And this is time in seconds to run this application. You can see that when file format application was set up to use the latest, and latest mean different it has different meanings in, say, 1.8 and 1.12, because 1.12 may have different features, more features is added, different versioning is involved. You see that light bars, you almost performance is twice as bad if you use the default file format, which always defaults to the earliest version of any object that is known to HDF5 library. So the latest is not always better. It really has to be used with caution and with, you know, always check performance of your application, because inevitably you can slow it down without any other reason. Said this, I can show you another application that has different characteristic. Here it is. It is the same application, but it organized data differently. Instead of putting all million data sets under one root group, it is creating 1,000 groups, and under each group it puts 1,000 data sets. And here you see that those light bars, they really create much less overhead for the application. And this is related to behavior of metadata cache, which can be tuned, and really that performance will be about the same. So just once again, word of caution, use features carefully. If you do not need to use latest file format, don't use it. Your application will run. Also, I want to spend a little bit time on this graph showing you that when library was light many, many years ago, you see how that application that uses absolutely default features of HDF5, it's performing like 10 seconds. And then in 1.8, there were some improvements done to introduce generic properties and new data structures in support of those generic properties. You see that performance went up. And when we introduced Swimmer, it was really awful. So we did some tuning, and now in 1.12, we keep things down. We're going down and improving, but we're still far away from 1.6 and even from 1.8. So HDF group is working on bringing those bars down performance, so we are on the same as 1.8. But once again, not every application was affected. It's only applications that deal with a lot of HDF5 metadata. Usually it happens when you have working with a lot of objects that are open at the same time, attributes, groups, data sets, and so on. Any questions about this graph? Then I will go back to my slides. And I told you word of caution about labor bounds. We publish compatibility information between the releases, and we're committed, and keep us to this commitment, that when we go between in the same maintenance branch between 1.10, say 1.10.7 and 1.10.8, we should be complying with binary compatibility. You should be able to drop your new binaries with bug fixes and even new functions instead of your old binaries, and your application should work without relinking and without recompiling. This is not true between two major releases. When you go from 10 to 12, or when we go from 12 to 14, you will have a report that shows many incompatibilities, and this is expected. But within the maintenance release, we should comply with ABI compatibility. So what you can expect if you move now from 1.8, 1.10 to 1.12. Mostly APIs that will be affected. It is in H5L link and H5 object interfaces. And why is that? Because we change since a wall layer was introduced, and in the past, kind of native thing like addressed in the POSIX file was used to identify the objects by the library. So we were using, you probably saw this h_address_t variable. It was removed and real identifier was created, so we can work with the objects that are created by wall connectors that have nothing to do with linear space in HDF file, or it will work with the native objects that are stored in the POSIX linear file. So that was the major change that triggered us to change several APIs. This slide is just talks about a new token type was introduced instead of h_address_t. If you really working on the level when you need to use some identifiers for the objects, not through HDF5 APIs. But to help with compatibility, we using compatibility macros, and in every new release, you probably so many times we publish them, and there is the whole section on our portal that talks about API compatibility macros. So what those macros do, they map functions with different signatures to default versions that will be available in the library. For example, original function in 110, and it was h5l get info, disregard this underscore, it is just reference link to the website that uses this kind of identifier for the name. It was mapped to info1 or info2, depending on version. Info1 was deprecated function, and info2 is the function. It will have more arguments, is now became h5l get info. And we list all those functions that become macros in our documentation. It's easy to find, it's in documentation, and you can find both signatures of deprecated function and new function. Also, some public structures are structured, and that also documented. So by default, when you build the library, it is configured with deprecated APIs. What does it mean? You can use h5l iterate 1, this is a real name of the function, or h5, which is deprecated, or h5l iterate 2. But h5l iterate macro by default corresponds to the new functions. There is a way, it will be on the next slide, how you can remap by individual function, or just compile the library, mapping all new macros to use the old deprecated APIs. And you always can disable deprecated symbols if you do not care about API signatures, or you just start working with the new functions. You can make binary smaller, HDF5 library smaller by using disable deprecated symbols configure flag or corresponding symbol in CMake. And you can always, when you do not know, if you, for example, a user, you can find on your, in the installation directory, libhdf5 settings file, which will have the line that tells you which default versions of API are enabled. So you always will know how the library was built and what that function h5l iterate, how many, for example, arguments it will expect. So what can you do if you do not want to modify your application? You want to use how it is, and don't worry when you use new library, but you do not want to update APIs that will change and so on. There is a way to configure it and just say that default API will map to version, say, 110, and the same is in CMake. This shows the command, and all macros will be pointing to the functions that are available in major 110 in maintenance releases of 110 version of the library. You do not need to do anything on your application. You can just go ahead, build the library this way, and link your application with the newest, latest 112 using all the APIs. And this slide just shows you how you can do it on application level. For example, if library was built with APIs pointing to the new functions with new signatures, you can say, no, for my application, just use 110 signatures, and this flag will override library settings, allowing you use APIs that was used in your application. But you have to be cautious, because sometimes it becomes cumbersome, because some APIs, like in H5O, and oops, I'm moving mouse too much. You will need not only to use one function and point to the version of the structure that function uses, but also use other APIs in the same set of routines that use similar structures. Otherwise, compilation will fail. It's still possible, as I show on this command line, but be careful which APIs you move back to all the signatures versus the group of APIs that also use the same data structure. You have to map those also to the previous versions of APIs. So I believe this is the end. The slides, we have all this information on our website. And then, as I said, we're always ready to help you. If you just send email to help@hdfgroup.org, we'll be able to answer your questions and guide you through your work when you're moving your application to use the latest HDF5 release. And I highly encourage you to start to move to the latest release if you haven't started it yet. So thank you. And any questions? So if we don't have any questions, then I think, oh, here is, thank you. I was not quite well prepared as Gerd, but I hope it was useful. Maybe you have questions on any other themes, please just ask. We have a few minutes and I will be happy to help.
Eventually, Elena, this is Marta.
Yes, hi, Marta.
One question. So in fact, I don't have a code that is using the 110, but I have one that is using the 112. And I have seen the new versions on the systems that we are using. So I wasn't sure if to use them or not. So for the 12, the performance is supposed to be relatively the same, or do you want us to track somehow and report how it behaves depending on the version? What do you recommend?
First of all, we really appreciate if users try new releases, and especially, you know, when we work on new maintenance release, and you will see soon on the forum, it will be announcement about 1.8. We provide, before we release, we provide snapshots, pre-release candidates. We really would like to hear from the users if it affects your application in terms of performance. We're really very cautious about performance, but HDF5 has so many features that we're trying to fix some way, and we may inevitably, you know, change something for other people. We have to be aware of this as quickly as possible, and it will be very useful if any performance drop will be reported to us even before the release, because it can be something, you know, silly that we can fix easily, or we say, okay, we need to rework and have different solution.
Okay, thank you, because I was hesitant. Obviously, we want to get the best performance, but if we move to the new version, it's gonna delay too much. Then you get stuck with the old version. So eventually what I'm gonna do is to test with the different 12s and let you know if there is any difference or input.
Right, right. We're trying to put, as I said, into new maintenance releases, only bug fixes, addressing vulnerability requests that we have issues, and we may add new APIs, for example. They shouldn't affect performance, but it always, you know, better to test. So we know, like I showed on one graph, we can see, for example, share the screen once again. you see, we even within maintenance release of 1.8, we saw this bump here, right? So 112 was the best, or even 184 was the best. So we can do something that really cause performance, not much increase, but it's really maybe very prominent for some applications. That's why it is good to know if people run their own benchmarks and let us know.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. It was very useful.
Thank you. Okay, then thank you all, and see you next Tuesday. And please let me know. It will be me, but I will try to prepare better. And if you have any questions, please submit in advance, so I will get information in advance to present. Thank you so much, and bye.